All right, sweet. So we'll just get us set up to share the link. Okay. And I'm just gonna hop on Twitter and share that. I'll share it from the Mercurians.
Can you hear that?
Hear what?
Background noise?
Not really.
Okay, good. Just making sure. Did you tweet something?
It just went out.
Cool.
All righty.
Hello, hello, Mercuranians. Welcome back.
Yeah, well, we're live and yeah, how are you feeling today? It's Cancer Moon today. Happy
Yes.
lunar return.
Thank you. Thank you. The co-presence with Mars is definitely being felt. It's a little bit of a difference than like those nice like Cancer moons that we had all of that time with like adverse the malefics, but it is what it is. How about you?
I feel pretty good. I started the day with a reading. So that went well, and just got a bunch of other errands and things to do later today. So
Awesome.
busier day, but it's good. I feel good.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. I did some shopping yesterday. I was supposed to be shopping for some birthday presents for somebody else, but you know me. Couldn't help myself.
I mean, it's
And
doing a return. It's like you can maybe afford a
right,
little something, something.
like I just have to. Because there's this like really great sale. I got this satin dress that was
And a
originally,
dress.
I know.
That's like
Originally,
a lot for a satin dress. I mean, that sounds pretty
well, here's the
fancy.
thing. Originally $65. I got it for 23. I was like, this thing fits me perfectly. Like, why would I not get this dress right now? I have to. And then there was a little corset on sale, and you know me and my love for corsets. And I just had to. And like today, when I was like tidying up my makeup for the show, I
Mm.
was really debating like putting on that dress just to like
Why
sit in
didn't
my
you?
room. But I'm gonna try and keep it nice.
Fair.
Yeah.
Um, all right, sweet. Well, today we are talking about aspects.
Yeah, today's kind of a wonky day. Rhetorius kind of like jumps around a little bit. Like it's not really clear if there's no like it doesn't seem like there's a purposeful order to these chapters. A lot of them are like really brief introductions that he really like expunges later in the book and spends like 3 paragraphs on. But yeah.
Yeah, again, we're just back to the same. We are left with a kind of obscure compilation of remaining definitions, and so there's maybe a little bit of like coherence that's coming on between the definitions getting introduced, but overall, yeah, it's tough to really say that all of these are really building towards something, partially because they're all just like definitions that you kind of have to learn. So they're not all like necessarily leading right to a technique immediately, even though they are all important in synthesizing your delineation when you're looking at aspects, because there are so many things at play with aspects.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, here's the thing with aspects is that like you can slice it and dice it in a dozen different ways. Are you looking sign based, degree based? There's application, there's separation, there's mundane, there's temporal.
Mhm.
Like the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
And so I don't know, I feel like aspects are kind of, they should be one of the later things that are taught, like if you're starting from scratch, you know,
Mhm.
because there's so many different layers to this interaction here, right? Like the nature of the planets, the signs that they're in, and the nature of the degrees that they're configured to themselves.
Yeah, I know for myself, like aspects were definitely the final piece to click in terms of synthesizing information and like reading someone's chart. Because you start off like talking about planets and planets in signs, and then you get planets in houses, and then like you maybe get the dignity involved and think about a planet's condition in a house. But then it's just the next logical step when you say, okay, well, here's a planet and here's another, and what are they doing together? And that's where it just requires more analysis of the symbolism and being able to fuse what they're indicating. And that can happen in so many different ways because of the nature of the way their aspect is connecting, whether, it's by just a whole sign or when we look by degree, which is when there's a lot of variation in the way it plays out. And that's what like all these definitions today are going to kind of bring us towards understanding really in-depthly.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
And
Go ahead.
I was just going to say one other thing, like how you mentioned like with temporal and mundane aspects, like today is pretty much getting into the heart of zodiacal aspects, so when we think about just two-dimensional aspects happening in a circle, like this is just all describing how intricate things are in just 2D. So there's really a lot to it, but again, they all have their little pieces of how they contribute relevance into signification when you kind of look at everything together.
Yeah, definitely. So we do have, and there are some little tidbits in here that aren't just aspects. Like some of the first chapters have to do with like affliction and like ineffective houses and stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, there's definitely, I mean, as you were saying about like two-dimensional aspects, like there is so much depth within only that second dimension as well, and
Right.
a lot of nuance.
Yeah, if anything, they are the most complex. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, mundane and temporal aspects like take you out of what we're used to, but like they don't get as complex as this really. They probably
Right.
could if we just spent time uncovering what all those nuances are, but at least the clearest way to look at aspects, which is in 2D, does have a lot of nuance. And so this is, like you said, definitely just takes more time to synthesize this kind of terminology with chart reading.
And I mean, before we begin, I feel like if you think about a square, right? It's
Mhm.
you hear a lot of words about like tension and stuff like that, or like opposition being like enmity and like combat or like yin and yang. Being able to to solidify like those kinds of keywords that you hear a lot in regards to them with actual planetary interactions,
Mhm.
right? And so, like a square between two benefics and how that interacts when they are neighboring or in adherence to each other, like what's all of those different gradients and how they interact. So, hopefully, today you will leave with a better understanding of some of that gradient.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, do you want to get started then with 26? Should we review that one, which we kind of touched on briefly the other week?
Yeah, it was like 2 episodes ago.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so 26. Oh, is it my turn to read first?
I think you started last week.
Yeah, it's your turn.
Um, so 26, dominance. Dominance and superiority is when a star situated in the 10th house makes a square to the left, which again is assigned a head in zodiacal order. Let Cancer be the ascendant. Then those planets in Aries are superior to the one in Cancer. Another kind of superiority is when someone being in a house on the right beholds one by a left trine or square or sextile. So he's saying dominance is when it's in an earlier sign and a square ahead or 10 signs ahead of the inferior planet. But then he's also saying superiority, which isn't just dominance. Superiority is just being in the leading sign, or it's also called prevailing, or being the planet that's beholding the one ahead of it. And then those planets that are ahead or that are sinister will cast the ray back to the ones that are dexter.
Right. And so superior planets rise before inferior planets. They behold the planets. They can look at the planets that are later in zodiacal order consistently, whereas the planets that are later in zodiacal order have to cast that ray
Mm-hmm.
and look back or hurl a ray, whichever one.
Mm-hmm.
So affliction and ineffective houses, unless you had anything else to say about dominance.
No.
Oh, one other thing. It is interesting how there is a specific like word dominance for that like right hand square with a planet situated 10th from another planet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it just implies a little bit of a different kind of there's a different connotation with that.
Right.
Yeah. So, affliction and ineffective houses. Affliction is said when when one is aspected by malefics or besieged, or applying to a destructive star, or becomes incolasis, or is opposed or is disposed of by one badly situated in the ineffective houses, which are the sixth from the ascendant, and the third, and the second, and the eighth, and the 12th. So, this is a very choppy kind of little chapter. One thing that I will say, it's really interesting how the third house is an ineffective house. We know that the third house is cadent, but the ninth house is also cadent. So what makes the third house so bad? It's just that sextile relationship, right? So once again, we have this feeble little sextile to the from the third place from the ascendant. And he even considers that to be ineffective.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it's like I think they call the ninth like the good trine because it's going to be a trine from the ascendant. So, like you said, it's enough to make it not as malefic, but I think the third and the ninth are also still just called the good cadence because at least they are aspecting the ascendant, unlike 6 and 12 and 8,
yeah.
which are
Hmm.
not
Yeah,
cadent but still unaspecting dark houses.
right. Like the dark houses have a negative relationship with the ascendant, whereas
Mhm.
like the third is kind of like an idle relationship. The ninth is a little bit less idle, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love just mentioning with Caden houses is like what Dimitra George says about them, where like the angular houses are like what makes you busy. Like the word in Greek here is like krematistikos, like busy or operative or like productive places where like she says, in the first or the 10th, like you're go like motivated to go out in the world and make money, or like in the fourth and seventh, like you need to work with people to make money or like help support your family to make money. But like with the Caden houses, like 3 and 9, she says like they're good for travel and learning, right? Which aren't inherently activities that are good for making money. Same thing with 6 and 12. She says like if you're imprisoned in the 12th or stuck and sick in the 6th, you can't make money. So it's like there's just something with cadency that isn't productive because they're not good for making money.
Mm, interesting. Well, now this is a little bit of a tangent, but like that raises a really interesting question of like I don't know. I hear capitalism like in the context of like making money, like anything that isn't productive towards making money is automatically like working against your favor. Like it's not it's negative, it's negatively impacting your life, which
Right.
again is really interesting because even before we had like a capitalist society like we do today,
Mhm.
when this was being written in like ancient Greek, you still needed to make money to live, you know? You didn't really have a choice there. So, like, But then at the same time, like your siblings, they very well can support your life, you know? Like,
Well, one thing I'll just say, I guess, in response to that is like what she adds onto right after she says what I just said is that what the Caden houses do support is the cultivation of the inner life. And so they're not supportive of outer worldly, external productive actions or success, but they help bring an awareness to the world inside instead. And that's the richness that the Caden houses offer.
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective on them.
I agree.
But all right, should we move along to, or well, there's a few more things maybe with the afflictions.
Uh-huh.
I think this
We're
is
gonna
also what people call maltreatment. He
mm,
lists a few
mhm.
different ways that happens here.
Yeah. We're gonna talk about Callisis and Besiegement like in the next 5-10 minutes. Um,
Mm, yeah, but he lists a few others that are pretty important.
mhm.
So basically being opposed by a badly situated star, or being disposed by, so ruled by a badly situated star, which is in an ineffective house. So you have to be basically in an opposition to a functionally malefic planet, which could be Mars or Saturn or some other planet that's beat up and not doing great. Has to be in an opposition to a planet like that in a bad house or in an ineffective house, or ruled by a planet that's in one of those five ineffective houses.
Right. And if you're in opposition to a planet in a bad house, that means that the planet, which is opposite the maltreating planet, is
Mm.
also in a bad house. You know, if you're
Mhm.
opposite a planet in the sixth, that means you're in the 12th.
Mhm.
The one exception to that would be the ninth house, a planet in the ninth.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, yeah.
yeah,
And so like for like maybe another example would be like for the disposition, like a rulership. Like if you have maybe Mercury and Aries in the first house, but it's going to be ruled by, say, Mars and Gemini in the third house, or even Mars and Virgo in the sixth house.
yeah,
So
and
drag
even
that.
then, like, there's still sight and mutual reception there. So, like, I don't know, like maybe that helps a little bit, but like maybe Mars and
Scorpio in the eighth.
right, Mars and
Well,
Scorpio.
all these examples we've given, there's technically an Antitia from Aries to Virgo, and so
And
maybe
then
the next one is Mars and Pisces in the 12th.
yeah,
There's a
that
gamut
was
of
where I was gonna go with it. Either Mars and
yeah.
Pisces or Mars and Taurus, you know. And then like that Mars is really not, it can't see Aries, and like Mercury hates Pisces.
But
Like
also Pisces Aries
I
have a
know. So that was why Taurus was my original. So yeah. But basically the gist of it here is like having a badly situated ruler, right? So
yeah.
like let's say you have Mars in Mars in Leo, but then you have the sun in Virgo, right?
Mhm.
So the sun doesn't have triplicity, Mars doesn't have triplicity. They can't see each other. Like the sun isn't really able to do anything to help Mars, you know? So yeah, that could be a badly situated ruler, especially if that falls in a dark house.
Mhm.
Did you want to?
Um, yeah, that's pretty much it, I think, for that one. Because after that we just get to 28, which is the effective or good houses. Um, so yeah, 28 effective houses are four angles and then the two trines on either side of the ascendant and the succeedant of the MC. So we're looking at angular houses 1, 4, 7, and 10, and then the trines of the ascendant, which will be the houses of the same element on the ascendant, which are 5 and 9, and the succeedant of the MC, which is the one that rises after 10, which is 11. So stars in these places are essentially motivated to action that doesn't necessarily promote inhibiting or challenging or difficult life circumstances.
Right. They are inclined to foster a reputation.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So
Um,
29.
yeah. A star is said to be in proper face whenever it approaches near to the sun or moon, as its domicile does to their domiciles, vespertine to the sun and matutine to the moon. Just really quick aside, vespertine, evening, matutine, morning, rising before or after.
Mhm.
For example, the sun in Leo, the moon in Cancer, and Venus in Taurus. Know that when the sun is in Leo, it is in its proper face, for it is in its own domicile and in a masculine sign. And if Venus was in Taurus, similarly, it is in its proper face, being matutine to the moon and in a feminine sign.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of ambiguity in this definition, partly because like the gist of what he's saying, he says it's in a proper face when it approaches near to the sun or moon as its domicile does to their domicile. So like it has to be in a concurrent relationship with one of the lights, like its relationship with the lights are in their domicile. So for instance, the sun in Leo trines Jupiter in Sagittarius, who's like 5 signs ahead. So if you have the sun in Taurus, then Jupiter in Virgo would be in proper face to the sun. The problem is like he gives some examples here where after he says, for example, the sun in Leo, moon in Cancer, Venus in Taurus, know that the sun in Leo is in its proper face, for it's in its own domicile and in a masculine sign. He doesn't say because it's next to the moon. So we're assuming that that's the example, but it's also weird because you're using a light as one of the examples, and normally it's about another planet's relationship to a light. So we have to assume he's not talking about the fact that the moon's next to the sun, and that's what he means. But it's also just weird because he's giving an example of a planet in its own sign, and the idea is normally that we're like shifted around to another position. So kind of weird examples here, and same thing with Venus and Taurus. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts on this kind
I
of scheme?
mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because, especially because a little bit later when he talks about house rulership, he mentions phase, but like, I don't know, I think that the way that planets relate to each other visually in the sky is
Mhm.
very important, but I also like this is not a primary consideration for me. It's not a huge mitigating factor for me either. Planets, like, I don't know, being in relationship to each other, like it's I guess it's favorable. Like, I don't know. I personally would rather have the moon and the sun in a trine relationship than adverse to each other or in a square relationship, you know?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah. And like Venus, like with this example, it's not really clear whether he's just talking about domiciles or he's talking about exaltations too, because
Mhm.
then no matter whatever way you slice it, like you've got something going on with Venus, like she's happy as either morning or evening star, and she's in her proper face either way because she's morning star with the exaltation scheme because Pisces rises before the sun in Aries.
Mhm.
But yeah. So, and then Mercury, like you can never even have Mercury 180 degrees, I mean, 100 210 degrees away from the sun with the exaltation scheme there. So, wait, no, I was right. You get the point, though.
Yeah.
Mercury can never be that far from the sun.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I don't know. I don't dislike this one. I'm not a huge proponent of it. What about you?
I'd say it's definitely a really minor condition. Like in an article that I was reading on it from Luis Ribeiro, I gave an example of Galileo who like used this Almugea in a chart delineation, and he gave it like 1 point. So we can tell that it's like a pretty minor, accidental dignity or, a secondary kind of mode of help, a planet can get. I know Ptolemy, when he introduces this in the Tetrabiblos, he calls it eventually, it's called proper face, is like the Greek wording, but eventually it becomes called Almugea, which also is like comes from the Arabic word, which means like facing. And so we can tell that there's a relationship in terms of like how these planets are looking at each other, that it's like benevolent because it resembles like what it is in the Thema Mundi or the domicile rulerships. But I definitely think it can be pretty powerful. I've definitely seen that come into practice more through a timing technique. And that's something that I've just been playing with over the last year or so, and that I see work out pretty well. So that's something maybe I'll talk about like later, but it's I definitely can see the power or usefulness in this technique. Yeah, I just think again though, it's on its own, it's just a minor thing that can be observed in the chart. Um, but yeah, as for the exaltations, I think that's definitely an interesting way we could think about looking at it as well. But yeah, I usually only consider it mainly with the domiciles, but in the same light, sometimes you can see that happen if planets move into exaltation together through some kind of turning. But yeah.
Right. Cool. Um,
Yeah.
right.
30.
Yeah.
All right. So joint possession is chapter 30. And this is when two planets are in a single sign or behold it, while they're both happening to be the domicile of one and the exaltation of the other. So, for example, having like the sun and um, Mars in Aries, or having the moon and Jupiter in Cancer, or Mars and Saturn in Capricorn, um, or they can be beholding so aspect to those signs. Like, you want to give an example?
I mean, there's like plenty of ways that that interaction can happen, right? Like where two planets of joint possession are in aspect to their shared domicile.
Mhm.
But I feel like the purpose of this here, did you want to read 32 also, even though it's like basically the same thing?
Yeah, well, I guess this is maybe what could open up a discussion about what the distinction is. So 32 joint rulership, it's very short. He just says joint rulership is said when the exaltation of this one is the domicile of that one in those signs in which the stars chance to be. So I almost feel like he's saying with joint rulership that there's a simultaneous co-rulership that two planets have over a single place as domicile or exaltation lords all the time, but
Mhm.
a joint possession will happen if they're both dignified in that place, or if they're both aspecting it and actively participating together in their joint possession of it. Because if one of them's not aspecting it, yeah, it's joint rulership because it always owns it, but it's not joint possession because it's not actively helping that place. Does that make sense to you? That's just kind of what I think about the distinction.
Yes, but it doesn't say when it comes to joint rulership, it
Mm.
says specifically in those signs which the stars chance to be. Whereas when with joint possession, it doesn't say that it doesn't say it says when the planets are in a single sign or behold it, oh, it happening to be the domicile of one and the exaltation of another. Yeah, you're right. I I don't know, but basically, I feel the point is that I was going to say is that like I don't feel like the nuance of these two situations is going to make or break your delineation, but it serves like a very powerful purpose in emphasizing that the domicile and the exaltation lords of signs work together to handle this place of rulership. They are
Mhm.
jointly ruling, they are jointly possessing this place, and how they interact with it and each other has something to say about that part of of your horoscope.
Right. Yeah, it's like to me, I see that Mars rules Aries and Scorpio and Capricorn, and Sun rules Leo and Aries, and Venus rules Taurus and Libra and Pisces. You know, it's like they are all equally in that co-rulership of those places. So yeah, like maybe medieval authors later on like hierarchized, that's not a word, the amount of points you could give to planets based off which kind of dignity. But to me, when you read a chart and it's like, okay, you're looking at someone's, 10th house, Leo, and they have a Virgo sun, but they have Jupiter and Sag, who can like trine it because that's trigon rulership.
Well,
But that's my actual gripe with this whole thing because, and in the guidebook that I've written about these rulerships, um, they're equal. Like the major rulership should be domicile, exaltation, and trigon because they all pertain to the rulership of a whole sign or all 30 degrees. All the other ones are for only subsections of that.
right, right. Well, I'm gonna skip chapter 31 for just a moment because
Okay.
32 is relevant to this
Yes, it
discussion.
is. Yes.
But chapter 33, he
Mhm.
says, Rhetorius says, this is page 23 at the top. A planet is said to be the house ruler when it has the greater modes of rulership in one of the signs. I
Mhm.
mean by domicile, exaltation, triplicity, term, phase, or aspect.
Mhm.
And so like if you let's say you happen to have a stellium, and almost all of your planets fall into this stellium, like the Capricorn babies of the 90s, where the only planet that was not in that stellium was Jupiter, I believe. Is that right?
There were different times when there were a lot in there. I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay, but you get my point. Is so you
Right.
have a stellium, and there is a sign where the ruler cannot aspect it, and the ruler is not able. It doesn't have like how we were saying with spear bearing, like the planet has to be willing and able. The
Mhm.
planet is not able to see or does not have the proper amount of dignity to really act in a constructive way.
Mhm.
But there is a member of the triplicity that can aspect that place by trine, or one of the triplicity lords of that sign, which aspects it by trine. That planet is going to step up. It's going to take that responsibility for that sign.
Right.
And I think that I don't know, like he's really emphasizing here that this is a matter of responsibility and ability, like a planet will step in and will take more control, will characterize a place in the zodiac in in a clearer way when it has more ability to do so,
Right.
versus like its textbook domicile lord, which is fallen and can't see it, which I don't think that can happen, but you get the point.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And it's interesting because here we're kind of stuck to decide if he just means the greater modes of rulership in one of the signs. Like he mentions, domicile, exaltation, triplicity, and bound. But he also mentions phase and aspect, which that
Right.
makes you question why could those things contribute to a planet's affinity for a sign in particular? So perhaps if it's like phase or aspect, like with the proper phase we were talking about, like if it's an evening star Venus, in a feminine sign, then she becomes much more nocturnal, right? And then maybe she just has a greater rulership over all the nocturnal elements. But she already does because of triplicity rulership. She already owns earth and water. So
Right.
it just makes you wonder why he mentions those two with this concept.
I feel I feel like that enters the picture when you're talking about more specific situations where like you'd rather have a peregrine Venus who is evening star and can aspect a place than its poorly situated ruler. You know, Venus is going to, like, if the natal ruler is adverse in the 12th house, but Venus can aspect it by trine and is in the evening star phase, Venus is
It's just
more
an
likely
enhancement. Yeah.
to,
It's just an
she's
enhancement.
more, go ahead.
Yeah. Just
She's
go.
just more likely to act in a supportive way
Mhm.
towards that place.
Yeah.
And that idea of rulership being like a matter of responsibility and ability, you know? I don't know. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, it does. Just saying that the last two quark criteria just make a planet stronger to jump in as the house ruler. But then that also brings me to the next point, which is this chapter is called the house ruler, which in the Greek is always oiko despotes, which literally means like house or dwelling ruler or owner.
Mm.
And that term, 95% of the time, is referring to the domicile lord, the sign lord. Because remember, the reason we call it domicile lord is because in the Greek they're writing oiko despotes, which means house lord. And again, that maybe is what brings us into how this definition evolved. Because when we look at a house, right, and we have a sign on the cusp of a house, and we want to see who's managing the topics of that house, the planet that is most responsible will take over for the house topics. And that's what he's saying here. So this became known as the Almutin or Almubtaz in the Arabic, which is a victor. And so there's this notion of a planet that has more dignities or more rulerships in any given places becomes the victor or the ultimate owner and ruler of that place in the chart.
Mhm. So maybe this was just kind of this is where that just that concept starts to be expanded, but we didn't
Mhm.
quite have different language for it yet.
Right.
So yeah, he's conveying that same idea, but I don't know, maybe also using like not the best language for it.
Mhm. Because that's the tough thing is if you just call this chapter Oiko Despotes, in some other Greek astrological manuals, you may be thinking that that's going to start talking about the control of the nativity, which is about finding the predominating light and seeing which planet rules that. And authors totally disagree because that rulership of like the life force can happen by sign or by exaltation or bound or trigon. And so that's where it's like this term is ambiguous in the tradition and extra much more so here that he's kind of introducing an Almutin, but doesn't have a new word for that.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely very interesting.
Mhm. Should we jump back to 31?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Um, why don't you go for it?
Okay. Incongruity of position, chapter 31. This is when the diurnal planets hold the principal houses of nocturnal nativities, and the nocturnal those of diurnal, or when the stars are situated in the signs where they would be quite effective, but the rulers of the signs are afflicted, so that they are not effective. So this, bless you. My allergies have been so bad lately just because it's starting to warm up, but that was an aside. Totally feel the sneezing. Um, this is just so incongruity of position. There's this element here of kind of like ping pongs back and forth between a number of different things. But the basic idea is that the position of a ruler of a sign or a house or whatever is posited in a way that is incongruent. It is antithetical. It is not working towards, it is not in the same, it's not parallel, it's perpendicular, you know? They are not working well together, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I know in math, like kindergarten geometry, like or first grade, like I remember learning these words like are these shapes congruent? And it just was like, is it a triangle and a triangle? It's like they're the same, but like they would show like a trapezoid and a hexagon. And it's like they're, you'd circle incongruent. So it's like the idea is like literally it's not like the position we want. So like nocturnal chart, we want to see that moon and the earth or water sign in the 10th house with Venus or Mars and the 11th, whatever. But here he's saying if there's just some weird contrariety, it's like, just remember, there's no specifics here. The idea is that you look at a chart and it's diurnal, but like you see the nocturnal planets pulling all the strings. And like
Right.
I remember an example of this that I talked about in our sect episode last year was like I was reading the chart of this girl who it was a diurnal chart and all of the planets of the nocturnal sect, including the moon, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, were all in the most masculinized sect rejoicing conditions possible. And her body, even though she was born biologically female, produced a super overabundant amount of testosterone, which ended up causing her lots of health related issues. And that's an incongruity of position. There's an inherent disharmonious energy going on when it's like all the nocturnal things are acting diurnal or vice versa.
Exactly. Yeah. That was,
Um,
did you have anything more you wanted to say about that? I
I
think
guess just the ruler of the sign, because that's the only other slightly different thing. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah. Well, he says that the ruler of the signs are afflicted so that they are not effective.
Hmm.
So it's really just asking, are or when stars are situated in the signs where they would be quite effective, but the rulers of the signs are afflicted. So let's say like you have Venus in Cancer and she's rising and she is doing pretty well, but then you have the moon in Capricorn in the worst kind of besiegement, like bodily conjunction with Saturn, decimating square with Mars in Libra, just like really, really struggling. She can only do so much to she can only do so much to make the land that Venus is in Cancer wet.
Yes, you're totally right.
Yeah,
Um,
so the moon can only do so much to make Cancer suitable for Venus. And
yeah,
from there, like Venus is not, like she's still helping a little bit. It's good that
right.
Venus is there, but yeah.
Yeah.
What was-
And like I know, and pardon our laughter, just inside jokes. But Chris Brennan, like I know he works off of the translation for this idea as like counteraction,
Mm,
that like something can be situated really well in the 10th house, but if the ruler's a poorly placed malefic in the 12th, its goodness is totally counteracted by that malefic ruler. And so in that case, Rhetorius would define this as well as an incongruity of position. Like, yeah, it looks good, but it's not all good because the ruler is kind of dragging it into this really tricky situation in the 12th.
right, yeah.
And then also that's a condition of maltreatment too. That was the only thing I meant to say is that counteraction is technically a maltreatment.
Right, yeah. Because the places that planets are responsible for, the places that planets rule, have a reciprocal relationship with the planet itself and its ability to characterize your chart, however it is.
Right. Yeah.
Cool.
All
So,
right.
did you want to talk about Colesis?
Sure. Let's do it. So we read 30 through 34, co-rulers.
Do we have any comments?
Um, Not yet.
Okay. Hey, besties.
Um, yeah. So 34, this is where we start talking about, yeah, aspects in motion, degree by degree, and how these terms kind of come into play. So chalesis is the most important application when a star moves towards a star, the swifter to the slower, if it's not more than 3 degrees away. So he's defining here that, obviously the stars have different speeds and periods and move at different rates. So you'll have one star kind of moving at its own rate, but a faster one will come up to make an exact partile, which I believe we already defined.
Mhm.
Um, an aspect that's completed to the degree or within 1 degree. Um, or brought to perfection, but up to 3 degrees as that aspect is getting more exact or becoming perfected, the coalescence is within 3 degrees of of the applying planet, moving to the heavier one or the slower one.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just a little bit or bigger orb than partile, but yeah.
Mm. Right. So
And
yeah,
this
essentially,
one, this one specifically mentions application. Demetra calls this adherence.
mm,
Um, yeah, I don't recall her excluding separation from this. It was strengthened, when they're applying, like it's much more prominent when they're applying. But I do not recall her not considering adherence once it has begun to separate if it's still in that 3-degree orb.
Right. So there's maybe technically a 6-degree orb on either side of the slower planet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, at least in terms of like how the tradition developed aspect theory and in terms of what um, these applications and separations represent, maybe I will jump super quick to a chapter later on where he just has one line that's really crucial to this. So in 112, he's defining void, of course, way later on in the book and has an extra paragraph about it. But this line at the end is really important and also makes me wonder if it was just a later compiler that slapped this in, because one, why is it separate? But two, it has a more interesting description. It says, the separations give judgment on the things that have preceded and have been preserved, and the applications give judgment on the things that are going to be and those that are hoped for. So yeah, I would definitely say, like, as things evolved more, the separations can kind of show what's already occurred, like in a horary chart, like what happened in the past. And even like the lunar aspect sequence, which is a technique you can use in everyone's natal chart, like that separating aspect can show like what's happening, literally like the circumstances someone's born into, or their like younger years of their life, and that next aspect shows like what they're here to do with their life purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's just one of my like favorite things, I will say. Like your goal as like the moon, like how you're going to interact with the energy around you and how you're going to make it your own. I will say that's just like one of my all-time favorite little natal techniques, and it's so easy. If you haven't looked at the planet that your moon separates from and is applying to, you need to right now before this episode is over. It's just
Yeah,
like so cute.
yeah.
Um,
That technique's amazing. And Firmicus like has preserved chapters and chapters on describing every planet that separates from the moon. I'm sorry, that the moon's separating from and applying to, and also like if it's separating from a planet and then becoming void, which we'll talk about in a minute, or just separating from the void and then applying to a planet. Just go get your hands on Firmicus if you want to really get your hands into that technique, because it's really cool. And I guess I'll also just mention briefly that Paulus says that with that moon's application, like anything within 3 degrees that the moon's applying to, or that coalesces, is going to happen in your childhood years of life. And then from like 3 to like 7 or 8 degrees, that like kind of intermediate range is going to be like in the middle of your life. And then like that final range of degrees for the moon, which goes up to her daily motion around 13 or so, or 15 maybe max, from like 7 or 8, that will be like at the end of your life. So
mhm.
another way you can maybe time when that influence occurs from the moon's applying aspects sequence, which is cool.
Yes, yes. That is another really good one. There's so much with the moon. I love her. We should do
I
another
know.
episode on like just the moon over summer or something.
Yeah, lunar techniques. There's some.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um,
Um, did you want to read 35 as well? I feel like I did a lot of reading, like between, I mean, like I don't mind it, but I
yeah,
can
sure.
talk
It's
over
yeah,
it.
it's another really short one, and again, it's sort of it's defined 35 is just called application, but it's sort of just about the moon's application. So he says application is the coalescence of the moon when it is a day's motion distant from the degree of the conjunction. So there's a few interesting things here, because at the end he says conjunction, which maybe makes us think that this kind of aspect can only happen bodily. So not by any aspect ray that it's approaching the perfection within, but also that he is sort of specifically defining it for the moon, because he's talking about her range of application, or her coalescence should be a day's motion, which can vary from 11 to 15, but on average 13 degrees.
And I do think that conjunction is like very purposeful here,
Yeah.
because there's so many different words he could have used. He would have said another sentence, or if by aspect or by partile. I mean, partile wasn't until used until the medieval era, but you get the point, like within a degree. Yeah, there's definitely like a specific type of kalesis with the moon applying to a bodily conjunction within her daily movement.
Mhm. Yep.
36, intervention. Did you have anything more to say about that before we move on?
No.
Okay. 36, intervention. Intervention is when a star casts its ray into the middle degrees of an application. So you have one planet applying to another planet, but before it perfects with, we'll use conjunction for simplicity here. The moon is applying to a bodily conjunction with Mars, but that square is, or shoot, I'm trying to like use today's chart, but I don't know what I don't think Mars has separated from Saturn yet. Just kidding. Um,
Wait, were you talking about the moon or just any planet?
well, I was going to use the moon specifically, but with the conjunction with Mars, but Mars hasn't separated from Saturn yet. Just
Well,
basically,
that will be
it,
great because the moon was for chapter 41, sieging. The moon did have a very
yes,
brief range this morning, but we'll come back to that. So
like,
we'll chew on that this
yeah.
current situation.
Intervention is just like the degree, the partile ray is cast, it intervenes between two planets that have their own interactions.
Right.
So it's a sort of interruption of the energy. When you're directing planets, like interventions with aspects are really interesting because sometimes even within one bound you'll have the aspect from one planet highlighting to life and then the aspect from another planet still within that same bound.
Mhm.
So yeah, really really fascinating. Just I don't know, pretty straightforward though. My
Yeah. Yeah. Like think, there's like lots of ways where you can kind of ground those um interposing aspects where you start to have like three planets involved in terms of thinking like you're trying to ask someone out on a date, but then like someone else swoops right in and say it's like your mom, and it's like that other aspect just intervenes and gets right in the way. That's the energy that's going to happen, so that aspect that intervenes is going to block the aspect from perfecting. And you almost wonder if, because he's saying intervention is when a star casts its rays into the middle degrees of an application, that based off of application as it's defined in the chapter right before in 35, that you almost wonder if it's bodily two planets that are moving to each other, and if that ray went in between the bodily conjunction, because that's definitely more powerful in terms of like, oh, it's sitting right in front of me but I can't touch it anymore because of this whatever's in the way.
Yeah. An analogy that I like to use for the moon or a metaphor, whatever, is like the image of a monkey like swinging from vines. And
Mm,
like her last aspect is the vine that like it's letting go of, and the next applying aspect is what it's reaching towards.
yeah, I love that.
And like, and we'll touch on this in more detail soon, but when the moon is void of course, like she can't reach the next vine and she just like falls to the ground.
Mm,
But intervention is like you're doing great, like you're swinging vine to vine, and then here comes this other monkey that just like smacks into you and like you fall,
right.
something like that. That same principle of there's someone butts in.
Mhm. Yeah, the
Mhm.
interposing aspects are really cool because this is really where you get into the realm of like planetary dynamics, and that's like what got really developed in the medieval tradition in terms of like just they made lots of different vocabulary for lots of different kind of dynamic aspectual situations, which can offer a lot of nuance into the descriptions of what's happening in a chart. It's just obviously more precise and you don't see them all the time, but like when they show up, using the analogies of what it looks like literally translating what it looks like is happening in a chart based off of it's moving here, but then it turns retrograde and it doesn't happen. Or it's moving close and someone else comes right in, or it's moving very close and then a retrograde planet swoops in from the one it was, it's like there's all those different ways aspects can get interrupted or have a third planet involved. And so this is sort of where we first start to see some of the Hellenistic definitions that branch later on into those more aggregate situations being defined.
Definitely. Yeah. Um, cool. Or like other times also, it's not, maybe the intervention doesn't prevent something from happening in its entirety, you know, like it
Right.
doesn't stop everything, but it's like a big bump in the road that like you have to get resolved before you can go do like the favorable thing. Or maybe it's a positive interruption to a really negative experience, you know. There's a lot of different ways that you can slice it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, say, for instance, like the Lord of the first house, so the querent or the native in their birth chart is applying with a conjunction to like the Lord of the second house. So it's showing like this person's going to really be attempting to pursue, stabilizing their income and making a financial stability for their life. But say some like opposition ray comes from, Saturn,
Seven.
who rules, like, yeah, say it's from the seventh Lord. And it's like, they are stuck, like they just are stuck in their relationships. They're stuck getting into relationships, or they're stuck, spending time and money with their friends. And that's like really detracting from how they're able to sustain earning an income. Like that's the idea, is that there's something that's going to be significator for some other topic that's preventing A and B from hooking up.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I feel like we could talk about this like
Yeah,
forever
I know.
in so
But
many
like
different
even
ways.
those, yeah, the last thing I'll say is like the orbs can be wide too. Like even if that happens over 20, degrees in your chart, if you see an aspect sequence, like that dynamic is still gonna somehow play out in your life. So it doesn't have to be these really tight ranges for that symbolism to still be in play.
Right. And let's say that the moon separates from like six different aspects, right? Or like maybe not six, like four. We'll
Yeah.
lessen that a little bit, but four different aspects. And
Mhm.
then like after a day's motion, like there's only a bodily conjunction with like one planet. Like that has so much to say about like this idea of like in your youth, like you're very busy, you're kind of juggling, like there's a lot of different things that are involved with your life. But then by the time you age, like, you're able to really focus on one thing and like
Mhm.
dedicate yourself to this one thing, you know?
Right.
So yeah. But on that note,
Just,
chapter 37, separation.
yes, 37 separation is when one of the stars has passed by corporally or by aspect the degree of the other star. So very simple. We don't need to explain that. After
Uh-huh.
the aspect perfects, it is now separating.
Yep. Cool. Chapter 38, bonding. The moon is said to be brought under bond when it has become 15 degrees from the sun, and to unbind itself when, having passed it by, it is distant the same number of degrees from the sun. And this is also said in the case of the full moon. For being 15 degrees before the full moon, it goes into bond, and having separated to the backside, it unbinds itself.
Mm.
So this scenario here is specifically talking about new and full moons. With the new moon, we're looking at the combustion range for the sun, or under the beams, whichever. But the moon is no longer visible when she is less than 15 degrees from the sun on either side, either applying or separating.
Mm.
So she is bound to the sun. You know, there is a binding element to it. And the
Mm.
same with the full moon, 15 degrees of orb on either side of the partile, like full moon degree. This is actually the same range as the Picatrix, which I think is interesting, and the same scenario.
Mm.
So,
Yeah,
yeah.
that is interesting. Yeah, the bonding situation is really interesting to just think about like what symbolically is happening here, because we know that obviously like new and full moons are like generally um I don't want to say necessarily precarious, but like especially when you read about like when you read the ancient texts, like delineating like, oh, they have a new moon in the first house, or like the moon is full, like it can often be like very unexpected or like somewhat dangerous things for like the native's health or life force. So the idea when the moon is entering into new or full phase, that she's going under the bond, it's like she's kind of losing her light and power to the sun, which is like very dangerous, because the moon, like we've talked about, she anchors everything into the physical world. She's responsible for everything to manifest physically. And so when she's under the bond, being new or full, there's like a whole kind of throw your hands in the air, like we can't really control what's going to happen anymore. And that,
There's,
yeah,
sorry,
you go.
go ahead. There's almost a level of obedience
Mm,
involved where like
yeah,
the moon has to obey the sun. And
right.
the sun, like the same thing when planets are under the beams, um, they're subject to whatever the sun says, whatever the sun does.
Mm,
So, yeah, there was something that I was gonna say. Oh, we haven't really spoken about lots yet,
mm.
but this
Next
is
week.
also, yeah, next week.
Mhm.
But this idea of the sun and the moon and their relationship that is also reflected in your lots. When you have an exact new moon, the lot of fortune and spirit are on your ascendant, right? And so when you have a full moon, they're on your seventh house cusp. But when you start to incorporate orb into that, it becomes really easy for your lot of fortune to fall into the 12th and spirit to fall into the second, you know? Or vice versa. Like they fall into these dark houses. So I don't know, I think that the lots and their relationship with the sun and the moon also plays a role in why it can be so precarious or polar, unpredictable, a very finicky interaction here.
Yeah, like when the moon is moving to go under the bond, like those lots, like you said, are moving into the dark houses, just as she's entering or separating from the bond, or loosening the bond is kind of how they phrase that, which is interesting because if you're familiar with the timing technique of zodiacal releasing, this is actually the same terminology. So like when the moon moves under out from the bond of the sun, she loosens the bond or like unbinds the bond essentially or releases the bond. And yeah, it's this idea of like I know like Demetra George, again, she's talked about it like it's like Saturnalia, like the ancient Roman holiday where they flipped all the tables and turned all the rules around and the slaves became the masters and the masters were subject to their slaves. It's like everything that is like totally kind of flipped and reversed when you have that loosening of the bond. So there's also this really unexpected quality that can happen like when like say you have in your chart like the moon is like loosening the bond, like if you're just born after the new or full moon, there could be like a really interesting component to whatever the moon's in charge of in your chart that like brings a really sudden or drastic or unexpected turn of events with how things may unfold.
Yeah, this is making me think of Ramadan and like how it's the first visibility of the moon following the spring equinox,
Mm,
which is that losing of the bond, right? This moon has left that 15-degree orb, and also both luminaries are exalted.
right.
And so there's this principle of like you relinquish like more of yourself, more of your time. You fast while the sun is up. You are like I'm not Muslim, and like I'm not like super familiar with like Muslim like traditions and stuff like that. So forgive me if I like misportray this at all. But Ramadan, you fast like while the sun is awake, like while the sun is awake, but during all hours of the day. And there's this connection with your body that happens. It's very grounding. It's a very spiritual experience. So I don't know, I just can't help but notice this kind of parallel that's happening here where the people are, I don't know, relinquishing themselves to God, the Son, who
Mhm.
rejoices in the house of God. I don't know. But yeah, I hope you catch my drift there.
Yeah, that is interesting. Just thinking about that appearance of the lunar crescent, like you said, after the new moon at the equinox when, yeah, both luminaries are exalted. I mean, it's such a powerful time of the year when yeah, it's kind of like unlimited possibilities. Like I know in India, it's like get married, start a job, start a business. It's like the luckiest day of the year. It's like known as one of the most auspicious moments to, begin something. So it's that loosening of the bond into this double exaltation for, the sun in Aries and the moon in Taurus that is like just brings that raw power and like submission to the fate of the world just falling into place maybe just right when we need it to happen and can let go our fear, right? It's like loosen the
Yeah.
bond, like just trust that it will happen. It's interesting. So
And there's something so liberating about that, like trusting your fate and the fortune that the gods have laid out for you.
yeah, definitely.
Mm.
Also, I just have to say we did get a couple comments. So Dom
Oh,
wins though. Hey Dom. Dom
hey.
wrote back when we were talking about the lunar aspect sequence that their moon is separating from Venus and applying to Saturn, and then a lightning emoji.
Slay.
And yeah, Jobu says, "Hey Jobu, I love the vine analogy." So yeah, about
Thank
the
you. Thank you. I was meditating a little while ago and that came to me. And like when she's separating from a hard aspect, like it was a thorny vine that hurt her hands, you know? Yeah,
that's good. Um,
thanks.
so the bond. Oh yeah, the last thing I wanted to say about the bond was when Paul introduces bonding. It's pretty interesting because he introduces it towards the very end of the book, right after he introduces the technique of circumambulations through the bounds, which is, one of the length of life techniques that's assessing the native's vital life force as it's distributed over time. And he introduces the idea of directing the moon or the predominator. And then specifically, the chapter after that, he introduces bonding, which he defines as when the moon, by any sequence of motion, so he doesn't say whether it's by transit, in a natal chart or by directions, like which is the idea, that when the moon reaches any exact aspect of the sun, it goes under the bond and that it becomes a climacteric period, which is like dangerous for your health and your vitality and your life force. So it's interesting as well that, it's noted in timing techniques when the moon makes those aspects to the sun, it's damaging. It's like she like loses a little bit of her, she's kind of zapped. It's like there's just you kind of, lose your force somehow.
Yeah, those like hard aspects between luminaries are not my favorite. I do see how a trine could be more favorable. But yeah, that
No.
is really interesting that like no matter what configuration it is, whether it's a sextile, square, trine, or opposition or conjunction,
Mhm.
um,
I think
all
he does give a smaller range though. I could be wrong, but it might be five.
mm,
Five
mm,
on either side of the solar aspect.
that's still really fascinating. Yeah,
Mhm.
that makes a lot of
Um,
sense too.
yeah. So, all right, that's bonding. Um,
Yeah.
so 39, void of course. Void of course is set of the moon when it joins with no planet, either corporally or by aspect. And
So
yeah, there's a lot that could be extrapolated from that definition.
yeah, there is like that one little sentence can spark so much discussion.
Debate, controversy, opinion,
Uh-huh.
hot takes.
Yeah. So here he note how he says joins with no planet either corporally or by aspect. Does not mention at all um, degrees or orb or sign boundaries. That's a really common thing today. Your moon is void if before it enters the new sign, it does not perfect another aspect.
Mhm.
Did you want to read a little bit from page 159, chapter 112?
Sure, yeah. I guess I'll just say real quick before that, at least what we can definitely infer about what he's saying here is it's not joining with the planet by body or by aspect. And as he's defined joining or application for the moon, that's 13 degrees, a day's motion.
Right.
So this definition could probably be alluding to voidness being she's traveling for a day without perfecting any aspect. So even if in a day, like maybe 10 degrees ahead, maybe she'll be much closer in applying to the aspect's perfection by then. But it's the fact that there's a day in between, and this is where we wonder, like, well, maybe halfway through the day, it will feel like the aspect's kind of turning on a little bit since it's closer. So maybe that voidness is really only valid for like a little bit, but like, it's like what range does that aspect application really turn on? And that's where other authors have said like it's a full 30 degrees, which is what is said at the back of the book here.
Well, yeah, and he mentions application in this next part, but not at all in that first part, which is interesting. Like in the first part, it seems like he's specifically talking about perfecting, whereas in the second part on page 159, where he talks about void of course, it's not perfecting. Also, shout out to the AFA. Totally forgot to do this today for letting us discuss Rhetorius. Thank y'all for being awesome. Don't forget to buy your copy of Rhetorius from the American Federation of Astrologers online or in store, translated by James Herschel Holden. Yeah. And don't forget to like and subscribe to us because we work hard and we love doing this. And if you enjoy watching, you should show your support. Mwah.
So 112. Do you want to read it? Do you want me to read it?
I can read it. I don't really care. It's up to you though, because you started reading the first part.
Sure. So void, of course, is said of the moon when it's about to apply to no star, neither by sign, nor by degree, nor by coalescence, nor by aspect, nor when it's going to make an application within 30 degrees. So he's saying here, whole sign aspects. Well, that's actually really crazy to say neither by sign first, because even if you have a range of 30 degrees, which is the final stipulation, pretty likely that's going to cross a sign boundary. So even if you get a magical 30-degree range, which is roughly like 2.5 days of lunar motion, that she won't perfect any aspect, that's rare enough. But especially after she crosses a sign boundary, if she's still not making whole sign aspects to anything, I don't even know when that's possible. Like maybe once every like million years. I'm not even kidding. Like that's crazy to have that much. So I feel like he's saying it could be like one, of these.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, at the same time though, it almost like neither by sign, nor by degree, nor by coalescence, nor by aspect, nor when it is going to make an application within 30 degrees. It
Right.
almost seems like he's kind of going down a hierarchy,
Yeah.
like, or up, I guess. But
Oh,
like,
hey, Connor. Connor
huh?
just
What was that? Sorry, it cut out.
no, my friend Connor just hopped in and they said hi. So
Oh,
saying hi.
hi, Connor. Um, yeah. So I don't know. I just think that that's interesting because, like, nor when it is going to make an application within 30 degrees. So, like, if the moon does not apply to any planet
Mhm.
within 30 degrees, it's not really clear whether it's 30 degrees after birth or 30 degrees around the moon, like 15 on either side.
Mhm.
No, it says an application within 30 degrees.
Yeah.
Oh, just
Oh,
kidding.
I have a question real quick. AstroSeek has an amazing calculator for looking at the void of course moon. Do you want me to share my screen really quickly? I have it pulled up here, and it will show the different dates, like how often it is when it's some of these different
Mhm.
ranges. So like the modern definition is the moon makes an aspect. Okay, so say the last aspect that the moon's going to make while it's in a sign is at like 25 degrees and it trines something at some other sign. Then it has 5 more degrees before it changes sign. For that range, even if there's going to be an aspect that happens at like 1 degree after it changes sign, because there's a sign boundary, this modern notion is that it's going to be void for that last bit there. So for 5 degrees, that's like 10 hours or so. The moon's going to be not carrying or not anchoring or applying to any planet. And so, that idea of that energy, what happens even by transit or in your life, if your moon is void, it's like there's no energy really kicking. It's like we've talked about so much, the moon has to anchor everything into the physical world. So when there's a huge range before she applies to make her next aspect, it's like it's Demetrius says the moon's slack. It's like,
The monkey misses the vine, it
right,
can't reach it, and it
yeah,
falls, you know?
exactly. So it has to kind of swing back and forth, and then maybe on the second try I can get it. But if I show you this orb here, so the first one he talked about was that 13-degree range, right? So in a
Right.
day's motion, this is for the month of March, And I'm actually going to turn off modern planets. So just to the 7. Um, for instance, let's look right now. We're at the end of the month. So in a few days, the moon's at the beginning of Cancer right now. In a few days, the moon's going to make a square to Mercury, who will be at 22 degrees of Aries. And then the next aspect the moon will make is a trine to the sun, who's going to be at 10 Aries. So the moon will enter Leo and make a trine to the sun at 10 Aries. But
Mhm.
from 22 to 10, there's like 18 degrees there. So it shows that distance right there. And that's more than 13. So for a whole day, so for like March 30th and into March 31st, the moon's going to be really void, essentially.
Right.
And see, there's a few
And
times a month.
however, this
Mhm.
is perfection of an
Right. Nothing
aspect,
about sign
right?
boundaries here. Yeah.
Nothing about sign boundaries, nothing about application, because
Just 13 degrees, no perfection.
right. And if we look at perfection, um,
Mhm.
then that does not, I mean, if we're taking into account application, then that example does not count as a void of course moon.
Right. So if I turn on this one, Vok or void of course ends by entering into the next sign. Look, it happens every 2 days, every
Right.
time the moon's at the end degrees of a sign for even just a few hours.
And I mean, like, to each his own. I personally do not use that definition of void of course. Um, I also
Okay.
especially because when we're talking about void of course, like it's the ability to bring something forward,
Mhm.
you know, it's that moon carrying that energy forward and interacting with another planet. I don't know. I don't think that a sign boundary denotes all of that. However, I will say that it will, like, it's not like not a factor.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say. When you think about the moon, like it right in terms of her productivity to like make something happen, when the moon is void, it's like there's this inherent inability to like it's like there's kind of no good luck. There's no good nothing in the air is like supporting. It's like maybe it's like the worst time to go and get a lottery ticket, right? It's like, or maybe you try to go to the mechanic and randomly your mechanic is sick and there's no one there. It's like you go to the store for the one thing you need and no stores have it. It's like void energy is when it's like everything goes wrong. It's like everything's slack. There's nothing in the universe that's like the angels aren't working from above to like try to, organize or just speak something into your head to make you go to one where it's like the universe kind of like shuts off a little bit. So
Yeah.
what I will say, at least for the sign boundaries, I have iLuna, which is an app you can get that will tell you when the moon goes void according to this change of sign definition. And I will say there have been so many instances just over the years where I have seen, even if it's a small degree range for a few hours when she goes void in this definition, that those weird things kind of do happen. And so I can't give it no credit, but I'll say it's nothing like the Hellenistic void of like a 30-degree period here. And like, look, you can see the option on AstroSeek is a 10-year table to look at when that happens because it's very rare. So
Uh-huh.
even if we just look at 2023, we actually have a few instances, that's pretty rare. Some years this doesn't happen at all. And
Last year it happened like two times, two or
yeah,
three.
right. So we definitely have 4 pretty major instances this year. And look, they're even barely over 30 degrees. But this moon at the end of October, it's 45 degrees, which is going to be almost 3 full days of a void moon, which is
Oh.
crazy. She's going to go from 15 Pisces to 0 Taurus without making any aspects. Um, and that is over a sign boundary and actually over a second one, which is that crazy definition. Like I said earlier, maybe happens in a million years. It's going to
Uh-huh.
happen in October, which is pretty nuts. Um,
So don't
so
make plans on October 25th.
don't
'Cause nothing will
rest,
go through.
hibernate. The sun's going to be in
Yeah.
Scorpio.
It separates from an opposition to Venus and
And
enters
then it's,
Venus in Virgo and then
yeah.
sextiles Saturn.
Mhm.
Damn.
Yeah. So anyway, these are the different takes on the void moon. Lily uses moiety, which is a whole other way to talk about orbs, but we're not
We'll
even
talk
going to
about that
explain
another time.
moiety.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's it. Those are the void definitions, and most likely he's talking about here voidness in a day's motion, which is 13 degrees, or the Hellenistic void, which is 30 degrees with no
Well,
curve.
and so when we look at the modern versus the more ancient definitions as well, like in the modern delineations for the void moon is like somebody who likes to lounge and like a person who is not the most like proactive, you know? But like in the ancient world, like if you were born with a void moon, like they're like, this child is lucky if it lives past infancy. It's going to be a beggar and will never work, will never have a home, will just travel with no purpose, no like lucky if they're even literate or can speak the language. Like very, very different
There's
approach
some rough
to
things.
the void moon. Yeah.
So yeah. All right. Well, should we move on to besiegement?
Yes.
Okay.
My least favorite.
Oh, actually, it's juxtaposition next.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
So
Um,
go ahead for chapter 40 there.
okay. This is something Demetra calls neighboring as well.
Yeah, it's translated as neighboring, I think, in Porphyry as well. And maybe Paul talks about it too.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I remember Porphyry and Paul from Demetra. Maybe not Paul, but definitely Porphyry is mentioned in Demetra's book. But juxtaposition is when stars are in the same terms, either corporally or by aspect, or they see each other in the terms of the same star.
Mm.
So there's three different kinds that are listed here. Um, when stars are in the same terms corporally, so bodily conjunction, you can have stars that are in adherence, which are also neighboring, or juxtaposed. Um, yeah, so they're in that range of bodily conjunction and they're in the same bound.
Mm.
Um, by aspect, so the partile aspect ray, the 1 degree aspect ray, is cast into, or I guess we could even use 3 degrees for this one, is cast into the same bound that a planet is also in. And then the third
And they're
one,
in the same bound, like it's the
yes,
same bound lord.
yes. And then the third one, the degree is not most important here, but they can just see each other by whole sign aspect, and they're both in the term of the same star.
Mhm. Do you want me to share Camus' chart real quick so we could kind of
Yeah, I think this
describe
is a good
that?
time to talk about some of these things.
Yeah. So with Venus and Mars in Albert Camus' chart, who, if you don't know, we've kind of been pulling up his chart in past episodes to kind of bring some of these concepts through the series here. We've talked before about this Venus Mars square he has, which is a dominance situation, and that's a maltreatment for Venus. But if we look at the terms they're in, they're both in the terms of Jupiter. So this is almost very, very close to a neighboring. If you want to just consider that even two stars can be in a whole sign aspect and in the same terms, I look at it that way sometimes. There's some sympathy going on between them. But especially when we're talking about this condition, in terms of it like playing out, um, in a way that's like really dramatic, at least, this is a case where the application is being made by Venus, right? Because she moves faster than Mars. But if you can look at, within Libra here, her bound begins at 21. So she's actually going to move into her own bound and then complete the aspect with Mars. So it won't be a partile perfection within the same bounds of each other, or rather not within the same bounds of each other, but within the bound of the same planet. So they would both be, if hypothetically if Venus was perfecting the square from Jupiter's bound, it'd be neighboring or juxtaposition.
And well, part of juxtaposition is just that they see each other while being in the terms of the same star. So
Right.
like
So
and Mars are juxtaposed here by sign and just by sight. Mercury as well, also in the bound of Jupiter, can see Venus, but there is no partile aspect. Yeah.
I think that's about it. I mean, we've
Yeah,
got Jupiter in
Jupiter.
his what?
Go. I was gonna say, I mean Jupiter, but
Yeah, Jupiter's in his own bound, which is pretty nice for him, especially being in fall, and not really having any other support from being in his triplicity. He's also not in his own decan. This decan's ruled by Mars, which actually, let me turn those on because, yeah, we didn't talk about the decans in his chart, but he's got some interesting decanic things happening, like Moon and Mercury and the Sun are all in their own decans, which is pretty significant because, like we talked about in our episode on the decans, like having to do with vagrants, travelers, pilgrims, artists who kind of live a bohemian lifestyle abroad. He was a very frequent traveler, and so it's interesting to see how he was sort of again able to get by, making his way through life, as an aspiring artist and writer. Um,
Yeah, I mean, also like, oh wait, yeah. So and then also like spirit is like if we want to can look at neighboring in the context of like non-planetary bodies, like spirit is neighboring with Jupiter, you know? They're both in that same bound.
mhm. Yeah, that's a good point as well. Like any two things, I mean, that's something I always look at is if there's two planets in a sign and they're in the same bound, that really reinforces their conjunction. Uh,
Right. They
and there's
don't
different,
even,
yeah,
I was gonna say they don't even have like a separate room in the same
right.
house. Like
Yeah,
they're one at
yeah,
this
they're
point.
bunk beds pretty much.
Yeah.
And another thing too is like there are a lot of different definitions of applications and like planets being moving towards each other. So like a co-presence, he hasn't defined as like two planets in the same sign, which Camus actually doesn't have. But we could say there's a co-presence of Saturn and a lot of fortune in the midheaven, or the North Node and the descendant, or Jupiter and Spirit, or the Sun and the syzygy. Um,
Right.
and then there's also the assembly, which is planets moving within 15 degrees of each other. So again, he actually doesn't have any assemblies by body. But if you can find any aspects that are moving within 15 degrees, like Mercury, although Mercury's probably about to station retrograde any day. So that aspect to Saturn might be in assembly because it's within 15, but it will probably be refrained, because he'll turn retrograde. Um, but let's see, what other terms do you think we want to throw at this here? I mean, like
Um,
Saturn's in an effective house, in the 10th. You want to talk about some of the other houses?
I mean, I can. I was specifically looking for like aspect stuff though. I was just looking to see if
Oh, sure.
it's besieged. I mean, um, each one of the stars is said to, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself now.
Oh,
That
okay.
like I
Well,
was gonna
this,
talk about Venus being fortified.
oh yeah, well, maybe we'll get there. But the Sun and Mercury are in a proper phase.
Mm.
So if we imagine the Sun was in Leo, Mercury being in the next sign would be Virgo. So that matches their positions in the Thema Mundi or in the sign rulership scheme. So that matches the 29th chapter on proper phase.
And by exaltation, Venus would also be in her proper face if we look at that by like from the exaltation scheme and not just the
Right.
domicile
So if
scheme.
the Sun was, yeah, in Aries, Venus in Pisces, right behind her or behind
Mm.
him. Joint
Mm.
possession. So this is maybe a case of where, all right, or joint rulership, Saturn and Mars are both responsible for Capricorn. But Saturn by whole sign can't help. Now, we talked in another episode about how there's actually a lot of support going on, communication going on between them both. So you could say that Mars and Saturn both are to an extent in joint possession of Capricorn and aiding Jupiter and aiding the fifth house
Mhm.
significations. Um, what else here? Perhaps we could say of the ascendant, Mercury is the house ruler, especially because he holds multiple forms of dignity in the ascendant, because he owns Virgo by domicile, by exaltation, and he owns this third decan here. And also, you could consider the 12th part, a form of a minor sympathy that he's adding his signification and rulership onto. Um,
It's I'm trying to see where was Mercury's last aspect? Is
Mm,
Mercury besieged?
yeah, I was just gonna say trying to Mars.
I think Mercury, I
Yeah,
mean, depending on
unless the
where,
moon, right,
uh,
if you consider the moon's application.
I wouldn't consider the moon because the moon is slow, I mean, is faster than Mercury.
Yeah.
Just depending on where Venus is at that time. But you can see here that Mercury's last aspect was that trine to Mars
Mm,
um, in Cancer, where Mercury was in Scorpio. And then Mercury is applying to opposition with Saturn.
mm.
So Mercury is, I would see Mercury as besieged here.
Yeah, I agree. And even
Yeah.
though I will think he'll station, there's still no intervention.
Hmm.
So, as he talked about in 36, star casting array into the middle degrees of an application, there's nothing happening to intervene the aspect from either the side of Mercury in between Saturn or from before, right? There's no other star that Mercury applied to after Mars. So it's from moving from one malefic to another. And that is chapter 41, which is our next chapter. So there is besiegement, which is, yeah, moving between two malefics, essentially.
Yeah. Um, and then yeah, I mean, casting array in between. Within the only thing
Yeah,
is this says within 7 degrees from the front or the rear,
right, right,
which this technically does not fit. I mean,
right.
so, but I don't know. I think that even though there is not a 7 degree orb here, I don't know. I think that that definitely still
It's
applies.
weaker. Yeah, yeah,
It's
it's
yeah.
there. It's weaker because, like, one thing too with besiegement is like you can often really notice it if it is bodily. If like you have Mars and Saturn in the same sign and then the moon comes in between them, like it's a really rough besiegement. Like when you think about what that word means in terms of like being stuck between like hostile forces that like entrap you, those bodily besiegements can be really, really strong maltreatments to see in someone's chart.
Last fall, winter, when Venus was besieged
Mm,
bodily by both Mars in
right.
Aquarius
And
and
Saturn.
Saturn, like think back to that time. Like I remember, like I could feel how besieged Venus was. And like anytime the moon would pass there through there as well, it was just like not a good time at all. That was like
I mean,
not.
she was just speeding up after going retrograde in Capricorn. So she was like slowly making her way. And that was how like Venus and Mars were like this together for like 2 months.
Yeah.
They like didn't move apart, which was really interesting astrology.
Yeah. Venus was like running from Mars is like the idea that I get.
I
Yeah.
know that she was heading right towards Saturn. It was such a,
Uh-huh.
yeah. All right.
Like
Well,
running
anyway,
through like mud. Oh, poor
yeah,
thing. Poor baby.
yeah.
But the moon
So
was also besieged for like 45 minutes today. That was
this
awesome.
morning, exactly, exactly. After she separated from the trine of Mars, hit Saturn pretty closely. So that was totally a pretty strong besiegement.
Yes. Um,
Um,
do you want to cut it here for today in terms of reading? Because then fortification goes well with like chariot and rejoicing.
yeah, I think that's pretty much it for what we can cover. Do we want to talk about maybe the moon's going to be in a coalescence next to Mercury in Sagittarius by a square?
Oh, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of thinking about Camus' life, of course, Mercury is getting the lunar application. And that's also, again, just an eminent thing because it rules the ascendant and the midheaven. So it's like he's getting known for his writing and his artistic, creative, intellectual skill.
Yeah, by modern terms, the moon is technically void here. As
Right.
well.
She'll have to
Yeah.
cross that sign boundary.
But yeah, not by any of Rhetorius's
Mhm.
definitions.
Right. Because within 13, Mercury is at 6. He's got 2 to cross into Pisces. So yeah, it's
Hmm.
only 7.5, 8 degrees
Yeah.
between them.
And you can see here that that last aspect was the trine with Venus. And
Mhm.
then the first aspect is the square with Mercury upon entrance into Pisces.
Yeah. Yep. I'm trying to see if there are oh yeah. So one actually interesting thing maybe with Jupiter is that his sign ruler is Saturn
Mhm.
by exaltation, and then also by decan, he's ruled by Mars. So if you use the point score from the medieval system, then Mars would have 5 points of rulership over him. If you also consider Mars does have triplicity in Earth signs, he doesn't get all three because he wouldn't be the primary lord, because in a night chart, the moon is the main triplicity lord for Jupiter. Um, but he gets something, which in a way would kind of boost him above Saturn in my eyes, and would make Mars the Almuten or the victory ruler over Jupiter instead of Saturn.
I also would agree with this, especially because Saturn is in Jupiter's place of exile, you know? But then at the same time, there is a degree of mutual reception happening here between Jupiter and Mars as well,
Yeah,
which makes them more inclined to work with each other
right. Because
than
yeah, if
to
anything,
pull away
Mars,
from each other with this opposition, you know?
right. Because
Yeah,
if we use the same logic, technically the moon and Jupiter will still be tied, because the moon will get 5 points for the sign and 1 point for the decan. And then Jupiter will get four for exaltation, but two for the bound. So they're tied at six. But
right.
in
So,
my eyes, I was just going to say the 12 parts in Pisces. So Jupiter might take the win.
and the moon can't see Mars. She
Right.
has no relation to her sun, her domicile of Cancer, whether it by Antisha, contra Antisha, or like zodiacal aspect, you know? So yeah, I think that Jupiter, this is kind of where that chapter, what was it called? The house ruler. So
Mhm.
like Jupiter is the house ruler of Cancer here, and Mars of Capricorn, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is
And I
interesting because,
mean, I was gonna say, I mean, Saturn does play like a very prominent role in what's happening with Capricorn, especially because they do have that contra-antitial relationship there. But yeah, I don't know. Mars is definitely doing pulling more of the Capricorn weight.
yeah. Um, yeah, I think that's it.
Mhm.
Oh gosh, Venus is besieged.
She is in a
I
very
just realized.
tight besiegement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Thank
just
you for pointing
realized
that
that.
out. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And again, she rules his ninth. Um, and just the struggle that he had, eventually he was able to attain success, in academia, but that was like an area of his life that was always a pursuit, but like had continual like struggle kind of
Mhm.
getting through there.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's a really good point because it's true. Like he did eventually succeed, you know, but it was not like handed to him on a platter by any means, and a lot of that uphill battle tied in with him and his life force. And that I feel like is demonstrated with Mercury's besiegement as well. So
Yeah.
that relationship between his health and his public presence
Mm.
and his affinity, his desire to move towards ninth house things, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one really interesting quote I just found about Camus, he said about his childhood, I was poised midway between poverty and sunshine. Poverty prevented me from judging that all was well in the world, and in history, the sun taught me that history is not everything. And that's really interesting. I also maybe would connect that to the fact that like the sun rejoices in the ninth place where Venus is ruling and is besieged. So it's almost like, okay, well, we can see the economic poverty that bestruck him growing up in Algeria, French Algeria, when he was really young. But it's like there was maybe this continual hope that learning about history, being inspired that like in the past, um, you know, he says the sun taught him that history isn't everything. And so you can like reclaim your own. your own future, regardless of your past.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I mean that also fits in well with like the ruler of his first sure being detriment in Sagittarius, but at the same time, like it's still Sagittarius, you know? Like
Yeah.
it's like the most hopeful of the exiled places, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well,
All right. That was a lot of terms, a lot of terminology and vocab today.
yeah.
But there
Even if you even if you don't have the vocab memorized, I hope that you got a good lesson in concept.
yeah. There's definitely everything here was still pretty fundamental. Like we'll throw these terms around a lot, especially like application, separation, the different kinds of maltreatments that happen. Um, but also we'll always just keep in mind that like these are just terms. Someone just wrote them down one day. The principles are what matter. When you see something that's not getting good testimony, it's not getting improved, but vice versa.
And I mean, like I personally I'm familiar with these terms. I don't use them when I'm reading a chart, like in my own head all the time. Like I'll be like, oh, like the moon is applying and separating, whatever. But I won't be like, oh, like the moon has kalesis with this planet, you know? Like it's you can recognize these things without like memorizing all of the vocabulary. It's good too. It is good too, but
As training wheels, because eventually you're just gonna gel into your own way of reading charts and talking about these things. So yeah.
definitely. Awesome. Well,
Well, thank you guys all for tuning in. I hope you guys got some good information out of it. And again, shout out to the AFA for yeah, helping to support us in doing this project. And thank you to you guys for supporting us. So if you did like it, please subscribe and like and share. And yeah, talk about it on Twitter with your Astro friends or whoever if you're yeah enjoying it. And yeah, we just hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
yes. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more Mercuranian content. Just kidding. We're not leaving you guys. But thank y'all for tuning in as always.